live. You're tuning into Cosmic Children. I'm your host Kevin, and today I have a very interesting guest in the studio with me. He runs a special sort of club in Singapore, which I find to be very intimidating at first glance because it's something that I have no conception of. So, Mr. Brandon, what is this club that you run?
Well, I should say more accurately, used to run. Because of COVID, I haven't really run. It's a tech meetup. So it hasn't run since, well, the lockdown essentially. So maintain the website, but that's about it. Dapps Dev Club is the name. dappsdev.org. That's the domain. Yep. So whatever we've done is up on there. It's I would say, an educational meetup more than anything else. So what I noticed back when I started it was that like everywhere else, there were blockchain meetups popping up, but there were only maybe a few of them that were focused on, the tech aspects of it. But in Singapore, you had zero. Right? Okay. They were all focused on how to invest your money in ICOs or something like that, which I felt was a bit of, missing the point. Like, sure, that's what a lot of people were interested in and they were catering to the demand. But then there's this whole tech aspect of it that was just completely ignored. So I've decided to fill that gap.
And how long ago was this when you first founded the club?
I can't remember actually. I'll have to go and check. So
gotcha.
Maybe I want to say 2018.
2018. Okay.
Yeah.
And it is the DADC, which stands for the Decentralized Application Development Club.
Yeah.
So what is a decentralized application?
Okay. Okay, let's okay, so when you say go to Google and you do a search on it, right? What you type in your laptop, right? It gets transmitted to a single server or a set of servers that is controlled by Google, which is for all intents and purposes a single entity, right? And then that does whatever it needs to do, looks in its database of all its search results that it has already crawled before, and then it sends you back the result. The key part of that is that there is one client, you, and one server in that interaction. Well, there might be more servers, but they're controlled by one entity. So that architecture is a client-server architecture. Okay. And it's by its nature centralized. A single entity controls it. And Okay, so let's talk about Bitcoin briefly. So they invented this concept called a blockchain, which meant, if I were to super duper summarize it, that will help. Think of it as BitTorrent is the file sharing, right? So Bitcoin does that with money, and they achieve it through decentralization. So you got this peer-to-peer network, but for the first time, compared to any other digital currency attempts, I should say, they managed, the inventor of it managed to figure out a way such that it was in the economic incentive of those in the peer-to-peer network to not cheat the rules, because there's, the what's in it for them or what's in it for me actually worked out for them. And the way it does this is it creates an immutable ledger. Immutable meaning, in this case, you can only add new entries to the end of it. You can never delete or modify prior entries in that same ledger. So by ensuring there's an economic incentive for all participants in the network to maintain this ledger and maintain that immutable rule, they were able to use those entries to encode transactions where you couldn't spend the same unit of currency in one place and then pretend you haven't spent it and spend it somewhere else. So so that was I could spend a long time talking about that, but let's go to the next part, which is decentralized applications. So I think about 5 years after after Bitcoin came up with this concept of an immutable ledger on a peer-to-peer network, etc., all these innovations, there was a sort of a flurry of innovation, but they all stuck to that same basic concept. And then Ethereum came along with probably I would say a world's first, maybe not in terms of like the idea, but a world's first in terms of implementation, where the inventor, so this guy is not pseudonymous or anonymous, like the creator of Bitcoin. Everyone knows who he is, Vitalik Buterin. He came up with this concept where you could combine this immutable ledger concept in a peer-to-peer network. Instead of just encoding currency transfers, you could write full-blown programs in it. So Bitcoin also had the concept of programs, but they were so limited that they could effectively only do currency transfers and not much else. A few other things, but not much else. With Ethereum, you could write what is called Turing-complete programs.
Turing-complete.
Yeah,
programs.
Turing,
Okay.
Alan Turing.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's some mathsy, sciencey thing.
Yeah.
But basically, it means that in theory, you could write any computer program. So it's like considered a complete system. Right. And so that sort of exploded the space, right? So you could now write any sort of program you wanted and put it on a blockchain. And because it was on a blockchain, every time you wrote a program, that program itself was immutable, right? The data that it stored was also immutable, but could be modified by new transactions, right? So in the same way that your account balances can be modified in a Bitcoin blockchain, you could then modify data by adding new transactions. So this created a type of, I would say, a concept or an implementation of a concept called smart contracts, which is like a very confusing name because it is, I like to say this a lot, it is neither smart nor a contract. Nothing to do with a legal contract, and it's not really smart. I think, right, if I were to sort of rename it, I would just call it a blockchain code or something.
A blockchain code, okay.
Yeah, or blockchain program, right? But this is the industry term for it, a smart contract. Okay, so now we can answer your question, right? That's the backdrop.
Okay.
So what is a decentralized application? When your client, so your laptop, right, instead of connecting to a server that's run by a single entity, it talks to a smart contract that is on a blockchain network. And because it is decentralized, the way that the code, well, the data that is stored on the smart contract and the code that is executed on the smart contract, they are both, they're not controlled by, or a single entity can't modify how it works, what the data is in it. It can't just say arbitrarily decide to stop it. It will continuously operate according to the rules that are contained within the code. So that gives it a lot of interesting properties. So the single biggest category of decentralized applications, or I should say smart contracts, is a currency, right? So you may have heard this term ERC20, or you may have heard this term ICO around 2019. So that was when a lot of people created their own currency and then they sold it in a decentralized way using smart contracts, and it just sort of basically people were creating programmable money.
Programmable money.
Yeah,
okay.
so they could just write some code and boom, you've got your own code, you've got your own money. Like you could always do that by, creating your own version of Bitcoin, right? Or any other cryptocurrency. But it was a lot more involved, right? Whereas now you could just piggyback off an existing blockchain, which had the smart contract capability. And by doing so, you could just focus on the aspect of it that you wanted to create, which in this case is a currency. And then, you can do that. And the interesting thing is you can set your own properties, right? So it's like you've got your own toolbox. Let's say you're an economist and you wanted to create a ideal currency system that you didn't have to base upon the rules that, just because of history, this is how money was done. You could invent your own ones. So, that was like the single biggest application. And I think it still is. Like, I think my information is probably out of date, but at least 2 years ago, 3 and 4 smart contracts were just this ERC20 category.
Yep.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ways and avenues and facets we can take this conversation in. But I think before we go deep into the definitions and everything, I'm just curious as to your first interaction with blockchain technology or Bitcoin or Ethereum. What was that like for you? Because you mentioned that you have been programming for a very long time. So I'm sure you might have chanced upon it earlier. What do you remember your first interaction? Was it very different to you, or was it very like mind-blowing to you? What was that to you?
Yeah, so I was one of those nerds who actually read the Bitcoin white paper. So it's like an academic paper that described it before Bitcoin actually launched, right? So there was a gap in between. And I was like, this is very interesting. I should, run this on my computer. And at that time, it was feasible. Now you need supercomputers.
It's like mining, right? Is it,
but now you need like a whole farm of servers to do it and specialized equipment, and you need VCs type money to actually run that feasibly. But back then you could just use your retail grade laptop to.
Back then it's like 10 years ago or something.
Yeah. But then I for whatever reason, I just didn't think too much of it at the time, and forgot about it.
Yep.
And then maybe in 2013 or so, it came up in the news again. I was like, oh yeah, I remember reading about this. What is it worth now? Okay, and then damn, missed out on that.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was, I would say, my first touch point with it. So really, really early on.
Yep.
So I guess I did what a lot of people would have done at the time, which is buy a token sum in Bitcoin.
Yep.
And then fast forward like many years later, not many years later, just a few years later after that, Ethereum came along and it's like, oh, this is interesting. Just fiddled around with it a bit. And I was like, okay, this is relatively easy from the coding point of view. It's a very limited platform, because when you decentralize something, at a technological level, what it means is that many different computers have to run the same thing.
Yep.
Right. You store the same data. You have to execute the same code in a redundant way. So let's say the 10,000 computers running Ethereum software, all 10,000 of them would have to store the same data and execute the same code.
Yep.
And they'd all have to come into agreement with each other in order for that program to work in that way, or for that transaction to compute.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess I again missed the boat, at the time.
Okay.
I was like, yeah, you can't do that much with it. And I guess like I was thinking of it from a software engineer's point of view, right?
What was that point of view like? Yeah.
So like, how difficult is it to store data, right? How expensive is it to store data? And, what is the latency? What is the throughput? Right. And I can define those terms if you want, but I think like the conclusion is that on all of those fronts, right, you're almost always better off like, using centralized technology. So I sort of like, this is not really mature enough.
This is 2017, 2018? Was it earlier than that?
Maybe earlier than that. This was like maybe about a year into Ethereum launching. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's been a while. So from a software engineering point of view, like this is basically really slow.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And I'm like, why would anyone want to create code on this? And I was like, okay, so this stuff will go through a maturity thing. It'll learn how to scale. And then when it becomes bigger, and then I didn't realize at the time that level of slowness and expensiveness to store data was actually sufficient, right? To build programmable money, which I came to earlier on, and that's why it exploded, right? So even though it was, I would say, and still is, the most expensive database in the world in terms of like how many kilobytes you can store per dollar, right? And the fact that it takes 15 seconds for you to get a response in the best case scenario, right? All of that was still, limited as it was still good enough to create this concept of programmable money. And it was just barely usable enough for people to want to use it, right? And the reason why they were using it as opposed to, the alternative, traditional centralized finance, if you want to call it that, or traditional finance, is, well, for two reasons. One is because people liked, the fact that it was decentralized and, basically like this is
cowboy. Like a branding thing. It's like branding.
Maybe. But I think it's like the fact that they enjoyed or reveled in the fact that it was uncontrollable to some extent. Yep. But then I think, and this is like something that maybe we don't get in Singapore, right? Because the SGD is worth the same every day, right? Next year is worth the same. It loses 2-3% or whatever it is. The inflation rate is stable, right? You can trust it. If you store a large amount of Singapore dollars in your bank account, you're not losing your wealth. But that is not the case in a lot of other countries, right? And so, like if you live in Argentina or Venezuela or something like that, right? You definitely do not want to store your money in the local currency, right? And it's so bad that the governments like actually have to legislate various laws to force you and companies to do that, right? Because otherwise the inflation will get even worse. And then you get like a huge difference in the black market price and the true price, the official price of the currency, etc., etc. So it's like, like you don't like see the value of that, right? Because you're in such a stable, or we live in a stable economy here, right? And then maybe I wasn't of enough of an anarchist persuasion to see the other aspect of it. So I completely missed the boat again.
So based on what you just said, let's talk about Ethereum. So when the technology first came out, I think back in 2014, 2015, from a software engineer's point of view, it didn't make sense because of...
It didn't scale.
In comparison to centralized databases or stuff like that.
Yeah, and to some extent, it still does not, right? Like it still has the same, expensiveness of data and slowness of transactions, but it's good enough, right, for this particular use case, right? And then there are newer generations of blockchain technology that are coming much, much closer to the centralized technology thing. Ethereum is trying to make that switch at the moment as well, right? But it's let's just say greenfield development, meaning you start a project from scratch, right? So let's say you have a canvas and it's blank. You can paint whatever you want on it. It's a lot easier, right? It's a lot easier to do that. Then let's say you have an existing project with all these users and you can't piss them off. You can't make them lose their money. You can't destabilize the network and cause frustration, etc. So you've already got a painting. Or maybe let's use a tattoo, right? You've already got a tattoo.
You want to change it to something else.
You can't erase it, right? But you have to change the picture, right?
Very difficult.
It's yeah, the artist has to be a lot more skilled.
Yes.
Right. And that is, and that's what they're trying to do right now. They're trying to like sort of change the wheels on a moving car. Right.
Before we go into the definitions of these things, could you please could you please articulate what's the difference between a centralized database or a centralized server, or rather a centralized application versus a decentralized application? What are the pros and cons as to why perhaps a software developer might want to go for the centralized ones?
Okay, so I guess you're looking for certain properties.
Okay.
Right? So, what I mentioned earlier on about the code not being able to be changed after the fact, right? So that is possible, and people are sure of it because that code is on a decentralized ledger. And part of that means that it's distributed across all of the computers participating in this peer-to-peer network. So all 10,000 computers on Ethereum running Ethereum, the Ethereum software, will be all storing the same data, storing the same code, executing the same code according to the same rules.
Yep.
And now contrast that to a centralized server, let's say DBS, right?
Yep.
So one day they could arbitrarily say, now your interest rate is different. And they do that all the time, right?
Yep.
It's in fact considered normal, right? Whereas if you were to do that in a smart contract, there would have to be an explicit function inside that smart contract that says this person is allowed to change this rule. And whoever was participating with that smart contract would need to say, well, I approve this and therefore want to participate in this, or I'm just not going to participate in this. It's upfront, right? Yep. And it's independently verifiable as well. Like so all the logic is out in the open. So a developer would say, okay, so here's the code on the blockchain, and it's just like a bunch of hexadecimal digits or ones and zeros, right?
Yep.
But then what they'd also do is that they'll say, okay, so here's the code which is readable by a average developer, right? And then there's a mechanism where you can verify that this code matches these, arbitrary looking computer ones and zeros, right? Binary or hexadecimal or whatever, right? And that is something that you will never see in a traditional system, right? Yeah, well, not never see, but typically do not see, right? They don't open their code to the public, and even if they do, right, when you interact with the actual server, right, there's no guarantee that what's running behind that server is different from is the same or different. Like you can't tell. From what they say is from what your view of the code is. So even if it's open source, like there's no way for you to verify it. So like if you want that degree of, how to say,
transparency,
transparency, ability to independently verify, right?
Yep.
So it's like, trust but verify kind of ethos, right?
Yep.
Then that's probably the main reason why you'd want to interact with a decentralized app.
Yep.
On top of all the other, properties that you get from a blockchain, which is, that it's immutable, blah, 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 right? So, being able to independently verify and know that the rug won't be pulled out from under your feet at some point in time in the future.
Would you say, or at least it sounds to me like, decentralized applications or the functions that you can do with it is a lot more diplomatic as compared to a centralized one, because as you mentioned, they can choose to change certain functions of it without needing your consent. Is that a correct way of describing it?
Maybe not diplomatic. I would say I'll just transparent is the word I'd use.
Yep.
So like when you decide to, like, shall I say this? when you decide to participate in something, the rules are known to you up front, and you also have the guarantee that the rules will not be able to be changed by another entity, right? And then I guess there are some aspects where you do want that entity to be able to make changes. And in those cases, then they might have a mechanism that's built in where they allow members, however they define that inside of the code, to allow you to approve by a vote, also by another mechanism that they would have to encode upfront, right? And make known to you upfront to be able to make those rule changes, right? And then you get into this whole other aspect of it that's called decentralized governance.
Decentralized governance.
Yeah.
Which is a function of decentralized application?
It's a category. So decentralized finance, right, which is sort of the example that I first went to because it's the biggest and most easy to explain, maybe. Because everyone understands money,
right? It's the most common use of decentralized applications.
Yeah. So then you also have decentralized governance where you use the same smart contract technology. Instead of encoding, units of currency being transferred from one person to another or one account to another, you talk about each account getting to vote and make decisions collectively. So, for example, you could model an election on it, or maybe in a company setting, you could model a shareholder vote on it. And you don't even have to stick to models that exist for these things. Like there's a group of, I don't know how to describe them, but basically like thinkers maybe, or experimenters, tinkerers. They called radical exchange. Right?
Radical exchange. Okay.
Yeah. So
what is that?
It's English is just the English words, but exchange is spelt without the E. So it starts with an X.
Okay.
Right. That's just a name. And they have a meetup in Singapore as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's pretty cool. And one of the things that they like to talk about is how to vote. Where one vote doesn't necessarily count for one share of the total allocation, right? It's so, for example, there's quadratic voting. So you either square or square root the vote count or the vote weight that you assign. So, and the idea is that you use this sort of mathematical concept to ensure a more even distribution or a more fair way of voting. So, if let's say, this is maybe a silly example, but let's say someone controls 60% of one entity, one person controls 60% of the share of votes.
Okay.
Right. And another 10 different entities control the remaining 40%. Right. In a 1-for-1 type of voting system, the person with the entity with 60% would always win every election. Whereas with this, let's say you had to square root the vote share, right? Then in that case, you'd have this concept of the 60% share of the vote would actually need to persuade the 40%, right? So just because of the way the math is worked out, right? And then you combine that with the fact that with another concept where you don't necessarily vote on a single issue. You vote on an allocation of different choices. And you say, I want to put 50% of my vote share towards option A, and then 25 towards option B, and 25 towards option C. Or one person may go all in, right? And then your shares can also potentially get square rooted or something like that. And, then you get like, you're kind of reinventing voting, right? You're reinventing governance or politics. It's quite radical, right? The new ideas or ways or new concepts that could emerge out of this, right?
Yep.
It's like sort of this isn't really a concept that has to do with blockchain. You could totally do this on a traditional, client server. Yeah, you could do it in a spreadsheet. Yeah, you don't even need a client server. You could do it in Excel, right? But this concept of decentralized governance seems to resonate with the blockchain crowd. So at a technical level, there is no need to use blockchain to implement it, right? In fact, it poses additional challenges, right? When you want to implement it on a blockchain, for example, vote privacy, right? Very hard to do that. Possible, very hard.
Yep.
Harder than with centralized technology. But, because the crowd that's interested in one overlaps like with the crowd that is interested in the other one.
The mutual interest.
Yeah. So that's where the overlap is.
Yep. So in looking at the services, the web services and the applications we use today, is it safe to say that most of it is centralized?
Oh yeah. By and large.
Okay.
By and large.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but would decentralized applications and I guess web services, would it be the natural evolution, or would it be for very, very specific use cases, perhaps let's say in the future?
I think I'm not sure. Like that's like kind of like a crystal ball moment. If there is an inflection point, right, it could go either way, right? But what I can speak to is maybe the current state of things.
Yep.
So the average person has probably interacted with a decentralized application, not in a blockchain way, but like maybe a peer-to-peer application. Let's expand the boundary a bit, right? And that would be BitTorrent.
Well, okay. Since you mentioned it just now, and you mentioned peer-to-peer,
yep.
Are they exchangeable, the terms peer-to-peer and I guess blockchain technology? Are they exchangeable?
No.
Okay, so it's two different things.
So it's a networking sort of architecture.
Yep.
Right. So peer-to-peer means like every person who is running the peer-to-peer software, whatever it is, BitTorrent, right, which is nothing to do with blockchain, or Bitcoin, right, which is a blockchain software, right?
Yep.
They both use peer-to-peer technology. So the software that you run, it is not only requesting data, right? It is also serving data to others, right? So in the case of BitTorrent, right, you are both seeding and leeching. You're familiar with the terminology? So when you seed,
yes.
you're sending little tiny chunks of the files to other computers in the network, right? And when you're leeching, you're doing the reverse. You're downloading, right? But I avoid using the words upload and download, except when, in that last sentence, and instead like use the term seed and leech, because uploading and downloading kind of implies a client-server relationship, meaning you're always going to be the downloader and you're always going to be the uploader, depending on whether you're the client or the server, respectively.
Fair enough.
Right? Okay. Whereas with BitTorrent, you're kind of doing both, right?
Concurrently.
Yes, most of the time. I mean, and that's actually an interesting point you touch on, concurrently, right? Because what happens in BitTorrent, right, is you would say it's a technological success, but it's an economic failure.
It's a Could you please explain that? Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, it's like when a file is really popular, it's easy to leech, right? So it's easy for you to obtain a file that you do not have by leeching of others, right? But there's no actual incentive for you to seed. Like, what does the average end user do, right? They leech the file and then, okay, I've got my file. Turn off the BitTorrent client. There's no incentive for them to keep it on.
Yep.
Right? Contrast that with Bitcoin, where the incentive to keep the network running is so high that it's not only profitable, but it's so like it's big business,
Yep.
right? And to the point that the average user is priced out of it. But that's like a different story
Yep.
altogether.
Yep.
But the economic incentive, like it's technologically sound and it's also economically sound. And that was one of its key innovations,
Yep.
right? So whoever designed it was not just like a crazy programmer, but also had a very, very strong economics fundamentals understanding, right? And clearly managed to translate that into the tech.
Even the psychological aspect of how people want to do things. I mean,
yeah, game theory is a big part of this. So, well, let's avoid the definition of this, but there's this thing called Byzantine fault tolerance.
In layman's terms, please.
Okay, so Byzantium, which is present-day Istanbul, was a city that was under siege throughout many times in history.
Okay.
Basically, the Greeks and the Ottomans were constantly at war, and this seemed to be like the prize jewel city,
Yep.
right? And it's this problem is named after it, where the generals who are attacking it, besieging the city, had to coordinate an attack, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
If there was a certain number of them, a certain threshold of them that attacked it, they would win, right? But of course, if you were to attack, you would have to expend some resources.
Yep.
Which is a euphemism for people get killed and
Yep. Yep.
But let's put aside the gory details of the origins of this. So it would be under your selfish interest to cheat and hold back, right?
Yep.
So how do you coordinate your message passing and sort of second guessing the whole psychology
Yep.
of everyone else,
Yep.
right? To do the optimal thing, which is to all attack together or all hold back together, right? How do you actually do that, right? And how do you incentivize that from happening? And so, like in the context of a peer-to-peer network, Bitcoin was the first thing to solve that problem, right? Yeah.
And it's important to actually make a note, because going back to the peer-to-peer, I guess, system of running with, let's say, BitTorrent or even Bitcoin, it is anonymous individuals, or rather people you don't know. And you are, with regards to BitTorrent, you are seeding and leeching from people you don't know. And there's a lack of, you mentioned incentives, but the technology has existed for quite a bit, even before BitTorrent, right? Because I remember LimeWire, and I guess even way back then.
Oh, yeah. BitTorrent was just like, I guess, the most popular protocol.
Yep.
Yeah. There were quite a number of others. And to be honest, I'm not so familiar with the rest of them. A lot of them were file sharing, in the sense that they were achieving the same goal as BitTorrent, but they were actually doing so with some degree of centralization, meaning that it wasn't really a true peer-to-peer network. Whereas BitTorrent was genuinely a peer-to-peer network.
What would be the difference if it's with file sharing in a centralized versus BitTorrent?
So the technology and the network architecture, so peer-to-peer network architecture, was a means to an end of file sharing, right? Much in the same way that the peer-to-peer network was, in the case of blockchain, was also a means to an end of decentralization, right? A decentralization of a storage of a ledger of transactions. It's quite a mouthful. So file sharing services do not need to be peer-to-peer, right? They can go through a file server, right? And these do exist, right? Yep. They're quite prevalent, in fact. Like anyone can spin up their own server and put a bunch of files on it and say, hey, here are the URLs, please go download them.
Yep.
Is the reason why peer-to-peer file sharing is, I would say, more prevalent is probably because of legal reasons. If you're sharing copyrighted materials that you do not have the right to share with others, then it's harder to be taken down if you're on a peer-to-peer network, because it's kind of like a sort of like, what's the whack-a-mole game where like you use a hammer, you hit the thing and then it pops up in the other hole, and so but with a client server architecture, it's like go after that one server or that one company that's responsible for the network, and then boom, the whole thing is down. That's essentially
the main difference.
Napster for you, right?
I'm curious to know your own opinion on, I guess, the legality with regards to peer-to-peer. What do you think about it? Because I think there's, as you mentioned, there's a lot of talk about it is legal to a certain degree because you're sharing copyright materials that you do not have the copyright to share.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on it?
You have to sort of separate the technology from the use case.
Okay.
Right? So file sharing is not illegal, right? But file sharing of stuff that you do not have the right to share is illegal, right? Much in the same way that, owning and selling someone something with Singapore dollars is not illegal, right? However, if you sell something that you do not own, then that's illegal, right? So, like, if you say that peer-to-peer networking is associated with file sharing, therefore that technology is illegal, that's tantamount to saying, by virtue of this analogy, that Singapore dollars or trading using Singapore dollars is illegal because it's used to sell things that people do not own, right? So you have to separate the concepts. Technology being, this versus cash, right? And, files versus items.
That is so confusing.
Yeah. Like I said, it's like the tool versus the intent, maybe. So if you use the tool with the right intent, then the tool is fine. But if you use the tool with the wrong intent, then that's bad.
Oh, this is so confusing. Okay. You mentioned about incentivization, and I think the example you brought up was Bitcoin. Do different blockchain architectures, do they incentivize the individuals to run in a different way, or is the incentivization, is it a key part of for people to continue running the software?
Both, yes. So different blockchains do incentivize differently, and different what was the second question?
Do all blockchains incentivize in some form of action the people to run the software?
Yes, they would have to. So I think like maybe the most well-known example is Bitcoin, and their incentive structure is every time you mine a block. So if you're one of those, nowadays supercomputers that is actually mining, and you solve this, I wouldn't say hard puzzle, I would just say mundane puzzle, right? But I won't get into the details. You're basically computing the same thing over and over again with some small variation, right? And you're the first one to solve it that crosses a particular level of threshold, which proves that you have expended on, if you amortize it, this much computing power over this amount of time, right? Then you get a block reward.
A block reward. Okay.
Yeah, so it's like a fixed amount.
Okay.
Right? And then on top of that, each of the transactions that are inside the block, you get a transaction fee, right? So if I transfer you, let's say I'm super rich, I transfer you 1 Bitcoin, right? I can't transfer you 1 Bitcoin, right? I would have to transfer you 1.00001 Bitcoin, and that additional fraction is the transaction fee, and the miner gets to keep that as well. So that's like the direct reward for mining, right? Like your operational cost versus your operational revenue, right? And then you think of it long term, right? There's also like a more economics based aspect to it, and the first one might be obvious, right? Like with any asset class, there is a speculatory aspect to it. So like the price is gonna rise over time, so therefore I want more of this asset class. So there's that aspect of it. Then there's also like maybe less well known, or I would say very well known inside the cryptocurrency community, but maybe for those of us who are outside of it are not aware of this, is that this currency is designed by its nature to be deflationary, which is the opposite of any government issued currency.
Yep.
Right, also known as fiat currencies, right? So, Singapore dollar, US dollar, euros, whatever, the government can arbitrarily decide to print more, right? And in fact, it's a given that they will print more, right? In fact, they aim for a certain amount of inflation every year as part of their economic planning. It's the standard thing to do, right? So, what that means is that year on year, your currency will devalue by that amount. Right, that's sort of that's how the math works out. Now, with Bitcoin, what it does is it says it's defined. Remember, I mentioned the block reward.
Yep.
So that halves every certain number of years. So you start off like, let's say your block reward is 12.5 now. A few years from now, it's going to be 6.25. Right.
And it will go down to 3 to
3.125, etc. So it will halve and halve and halve.
Yep.
And so, and the gap between each halving stays the same, right? So it basically, if you were to graph it,
what is this?
This is audio, I realize, but I'm sort of making an asymptotic curve with my hand. So it approaches this theoretical maximum without ever actually touching it. But in practice, they've done the math and it's practically going to flatten out by the time it hits, can't remember, I think it's the year 2100, right?
Wonderful.
So at that point of time, right, the block reward will be effectively zero, and the total supply, right, of all of the Bitcoin that there is in the world and can ever be, right, will remain that amount. Fixed, right? And because of this, right, and the total supply is locked and is encoded in the code. So unless someone comes along and says, I want to change this rule, and the majority of Bitcoin miners agree that they want to change this rule, you can take it as a given that the total supply will never exceed this amount. And so therefore, economists will say this is a deflationary currency. Well, it's definitely deflationary relative to any fiat currency or government issued currency.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's the sort of
incentive.
Another incentive. Yeah. So I sort of went over two like sort of operational incentive mechanisms and two economics based incentive mechanisms.
It's interesting
so it all
because
comes together.
It's very interesting because what you just described about, I think, government issued money, which is fiat currency, right? In the beginning, you talked about how because of Ethereum and I guess this decentralized nature of it, people were using it to create their own currency. It sounds exactly like that because they have a certain fixed monetary policy. They have to print more. They have to, I guess, quote unquote, create more, which goes back into what people were using, I guess, the Ethereum platform to create their own currency. They can create at will.
That's kind of like, it's an interesting thing because people invent their own currency, and of course, not all of them will do it with the same set of economic rules, right?
Economic rules, interesting. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, there is this whole topic called token economics, which has been
economics. Okay.
Contracted into tokenomics. Right.
It sounds like a rap song. Okay. Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if there were
okay.
Someone's got to create a song for tokenomics.
But is token used in a similar fashion to currency in the development space? Like, is there a difference?
Yeah. That's actually a common misconception because the difference is technical. The end user sees them as the same thing.
So the layman sees it as the same thing, but on the technical side, if you are a software developer, you have to know the difference.
Yes, definitely. Okay. And even as an end user, to some extent, you do need to know the difference. It's just that from what I've seen so far, like it's a point of major confusion, and a lot of people don't get it. I actually do have an explainer video that goes into this. It's 3.5 minutes long. It's on the RSK website. I work for a blockchain company called RSK. So I got an explainer video that kind of explains what exactly are the similarities and differences between a cryptocurrency and a ERC20 token, which is what most people refer to when they say token. Right?
What is ERC?
We're going to spend this entire conversation with definitions. So it's just like a ID number, a serial number assigned to different proposals.
Yep.
And one category of proposals has to do with tokens, right? And so the most popular one is ERC20. And this is the token standard for smart contracts that is most similar to mimicking cash.
Okay.
Right? Okay. So, for example, we have a completely different category of tokens called non-fungible tokens. So ERC20s are considered fungible because they're divisible, they're interchangeable. So 1 unit of a $50 bill, right? I can divide it into 5 $10 bills, right? Or 10 $5 bills, whatever, right? And if I gave you my $50 bill and you gave me your $50 bill, who cares?
Yep.
It's, there's no difference in value, right? So that's an example of a fungible token, right? Now, a non-fungible token is, let's say you take that poster over there, right? And you say, I put the rights to ownership of that poster, right? Inside of a token. So that poster is not interchangeable with another. This is a one of a kind, right?
Fair enough.
And if I were to take a scissor to it and cut it up into a few pieces, then it loses value. It's not the same as before, right? It's not divisible. It's not interchangeable. So there are different token standards in play, and this is just one of them.
Is there ERC 1 to 19, or did you just
but they're not necessarily all adopted, meaning they're not in use. And they also don't all have to do with tokens. Right? Okay. There are a lot of, in fact, most of the ERCs, it stands for Ethereum Request for Comment. And confusingly, it's interchangeable with EIP, which is Ethereum Improvement Proposal, right? And they all have to do with like people starting a discussion or a debate and then ending up with, hopefully, if they get through the entire process, a change to the underlying protocol or defining a standard or whatever it is that is widely accepted by the community.
Does what you just said, does it go back to the governance thing you were talking about initially? Deciding like what to improve, because it's improvement standard, right?
Yeah. So you can use decentralized governance for this. However, so far it doesn't seem to be the case. Like I see most of the governance happening via the equivalent of forum comments, right?
Is that normal, or is that
that seems to be the way it is at the moment. However, I do see some form of decentralized governance happening at the improvement proposal things. I do see that happening as well in the space.
Yep.
However, I will say that if there is a change mandated by an EIP, an improvement proposal, and that still needs to be in some sense voted on by the miners on that network, right? So if they don't accept the improvement proposal, they can just ignore it and continue according to the existing or prior rules. And then that's also a form of decentralized governance. It's just that it didn't involve smart contracts, right? It's just like at the protocol level.
Because I think it goes back to the incentivization about, I think if you're a miner on this particular thing, if whatever you're doing is profit driven, it has to make monetary sense.
Yes. Well, I mean, I would say that the community around this doesn't only care about money, or I would like to think so. It cares about money and the future of decentralization, the future of the platform. And, like if there is a lot of community spirit behind it and it is extremely popular, then it is a disincentive for the miners to go only in their own selfish interest, right? Because then what happens if they use the utility, right, and people go to a different competing platform, right? So there's like a whole bunch of game theory going on in this as well. So, the miners have to decide, and at the end of the day, if the majority of it go with it because it's against their monetary self-interest, but it's in the platform's self-interest and they're thinking more long-term, then so be it, right? But they could also say, I want to maximize short-term gains and then not go with what the community has agreed upon off-chain, so to speak.
So as a software developer and as a programmer, are all these concepts, do they interest or do they excite you with regard to the process? Because all these concepts are sort of abstract when you think about it being a little bit radical, it being like so removed from how it is currently, that it is, at least from what I can tell, it's not just about the code. It's not just about writing the actual thing. Like you have to have a certain sense of, I guess the word is anarchy, or to rebel, or to whatever. Like, do these abstract concepts, do they influence, or I guess the word is excite, like, does it interest you in that way?
Yeah. I mean, I've never thought about it in those terms, but
how have you seen it? Yeah.
So, like, to some extent, like, novelty is exciting, right? Where as humans, like, naturally wired to seek out something that is different from the norm.
Yep.
Right? Like, there's always like some part of your brain, I don't know whether this is just me or, not all people, it's always some part of your brain that wants familiarity and comfort. But then once you've got enough of that, then the other part of your brain just sort of switches on and says, I want something new.
Yes.
It's like, suddenly your eyes pop open and like, what else is out there?
Yep.
And I guess the fact that you're not really like sort of laying bricks or digging a hole or something, you're not doing menial labor, right, already connotes that you've got the standard stuff sorted out, right? Your day-to-day is normal and predictable for the most part, right? And so you spend a larger proportion of your brain time, if you will, thinking about novel things than usual, right? And so when you're in this space that is sort of seemingly exploding or teeming with possibilities, and you kind of have a toolbox that has less red tape around it, right? Okay. That's a very exciting thing, right? So, like, if you wanted to be an economist with the power to influence inflation rates, or create your own currency, or design your own auction system, or invent a new form of politics based on a novel voting system, right? You would need to probably spend 10 years in a grassroots organization, bootlicking to some politician, or you would need to have a PhD in economics and then be the best in your field, whatever, right? It'd be a long, grueling effort, and a very, very tiny fraction of anyone who wants to go down each of these paths would actually get to be in that position. Right? Like, how many of them are there, in Singapore?
A handful.
Exactly, right? So let's say that's 5 people, right? And we've got 5 to 7 million people, right? So
what percentile is that?
Less than 1 in a million, right? Whereas what if I told you that you could probably read a few books on economics, a few books on coding, and you could do any one of those things in theory, right? The amount of red tape that exists that takes you from getting to from a lay person, if you will, right? Like idealistic, I have an idea stage, to being able to execute it with real people, real resources, right, is just that much shorter, right? You could feasibly do it in months if you're really smart, maybe a few years, but you wouldn't have to be a 1 in a million. You wouldn't have to spend your entire career to get there, right? It's actually attainable for the average person, and that's exciting, right? And the part of your brain that is like excited by novel things says, hey, this is not just novel, this is novel and feasible. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still hard. And most people who do this, they invent their own currency or their voting system or whatever, right? It will most likely fail, right? But at least they got to try it in the real world, right? And the chances of success, as dismal as it is, right, still higher than the traditional route.
I think in the analogy that you just mentioned, in comparison to what was it like before and what is it like now, if you have, to your point, the right tools and the right information, and you are, I guess, committed to making it work, or to actually create something, it is actually possible from what you just mentioned, like to take an idea from the prototype stage and to push it out to a product. Whether if it's successful or fail, I think that's a different conversation, but it is actually possible to push out something. I mean, the term mentioned earlier on, that should be the song of a rap song, perhaps. Tokenomics. I think there are two books, authoritative references on that topic, right? And one of them is written by someone in Singapore, and from Singapore at least, and she consults all over the world, and she's really young. Like it's like someone to get to that level, right? In such a short period of time would not have been possible without the space and the speed with which the accelerated path that you can go on. Right. It's just crazy, right? Like the level of accomplishment you can get to, and just by virtue of removing that level of red tape that just happens to be the way it is. Even with regards even with regards to the information that's out there that is quote unquote readily available, if you know what to look at, you know what to search for. So it's not about being held back by red tape so much. It's now only you being held back by your knowledge, ability to execute. So with, at least from my point of view, the whole cryptocurrency and the whole space is, to your point, there isn't a lot of red tape or legalities to it to a certain degree. But does that mean that there's a lot of misinformation and I guess what's the word for it? Untrustworthy actors in the space, because it is so wild. So just because there's no red tape doesn't mean that there isn't legalities involved in this. In fact, I would say the opposite, right? There's a lot of FUD, to use Reddit lingo, fear, uncertainty, and doubt in this space. and that extends to the official level, the regulatory bodies, whoever's in charge, right? The ones who have the control of the red tape right now. So, for example, I think I have an example that would sort of apply to both of your questions, right? So, initial coin offerings, ICOs, they sort of just exploded in 2018, right? So everyone heard about tokens, right? In the news for the first time, if they have, that 2018 probably was it, right? And that essentially was, for the most part, unregulated security offerings, right? So you're selling some tokens your
for
own
a certain
currency, right?
Yeah. Well, debate is at a technical level, it can be a currency, but a lot of these projects, they were selling it as an investment to own and that's how it sort of falls into this legal gray area where regulators have to come in and say, I classify this as a utility token, meaning it's actually a token that you use for a particular, usage. Utility, or it's a security, meaning you're trying to sell something that is akin to shares, or something for investors to buy and speculate on. Don't quote me on this. I'm not a finance person, but the problem at that point of time was that too many people were able to do this, and it was unregulatable. So what happened was the governments realized that they could control some aspect of it, which was when fiat currency was being sold to purchase these tokens, right? And so then that's where they applied their regulatory pressure. So, and I guess they were right to do so, because answer the second part of your questions, a lot of them were fly-by-night operations. They'd collect the money in their ICO and then sort of promise that they would build XYZ, and then they would just disappear.
Oh shit!
Right. So it's like a Wild West cowboy kind of thing, and you have to do your own research, right? So if you were to buy a security offering in the traditional finance space in Singapore, you will have the assurance that it's been regulated by all the authorities, including MAS. Right? You wouldn't be able to buy shares in Singapore of any company unless it's regulated in some way by the government, right? But then once you get into this crypto space, and suddenly, like the government can't tell you to do what anymore, what to do anymore, and that's inherently risky, right? And that's why I say, you can sort of work around it. Like you can find some ways to get your fiat currency into the crypto space, but if you do so, right, it's at your own risk, right? And it pains me to say this, because like I actually work in the blockchain space in a legitimate company, right? But there's just, because of a lack of regulations, there are so many possibilities, and a lot of people there are not in it for the right reasons, right? They use decentralization not because they believe in the ethos of it, but because they say, oh, this is an easier way to
do shady things.
Yeah, because there's less accountability. But yeah, and maybe the other thing, apart from the legalities and all of that, the other thing to be buyer beware is, even if the ICOs have the best intent, not a lot of them, right, coming back to the tokenomics conversation and the fact that anyone can design it, not a lot of them get it right from an economics point of view, right? So what happens in an ICO is you have this total supply of tokens, however you've designed the total amount to be, and a certain share is allocated to the founders, whatever, and then the rest of it is put up for sale. People exchange an existing cryptocurrency for this new token that they think will appreciate. And then the clock strikes midnight, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and boom, the amounts are available in all of these people's accounts that have purchased them. And 99% of the time, what happens to the price graph is it just goes down.
Oh, it's a sharp turn.
Yeah, and
it's a sharp drop.
And you like, and then you get all these rage comments like, oh, I thought you would, and like this happens even for legit projects, right? So for the non-legit projects, this happens because the founders, they just dump their shares immediately, which exacerbates the problem. But even when it is a legit project, the people who purchase in the ICO, right? Basically the demand is going to be the same before and after. Most of the time, but then there's a sudden increase in supply. So economic theory says you got to find the new intersection of demand and supply. That's your new price, and that's why it drops immediately. And not enough projects actually, take this into account. I mean, now that the space is more mature, you see things like a delayed release where, the tokens are released in tranches of, X% per month or whatever it is, and on different timescales for different categories of like founders, VC investors, various tiers of ICO purchases, etc. Like that's a more mature model, and I'm glad that the space is going towards that. But like in the cowboy days, like you would just just see 99% of the time it just be a vertical drop off a cliff as soon as it was available on an exchange. It'd just be silly.
You mentioned about the ethos of, I guess, decentralization. Could you speak to that, and what does it mean for a company to want to create something decentralized? Because a company, like, it's sort of like a centralization of, I guess, developers and stuff like that. But what does it mean for a centralized company to create something decentralized? Is there like a paradox there?
Yeah. Okay, so I think the companies that do this right and truly have this at heart, they do have stated in their roadmap a certain number of years before they project that the company itself will dissolve or relinquish control over the blockchain project that they are bootstrapping, right? So bootstrap is the entrepreneurial word for initialization, right? So they define a certain number of years where they're going to take in their VC funding traditionally, or their token sale or ICO, whatever form of token sale they choose. And the funds that they raise there, they'll have a burn rate for X number of years by which they are going to project that the project will become self-sufficient and run by itself through members of the community who believe in the project, right? And I think that's admirable, right? That's a company that has the ethos of decentralization at heart, because they see the necessity to build a company, right? Because they need to concentrate and focus, and that implies centralization. But if they have a roadmap saying, okay, I'm achieving this level of decentralization over time, then at some point it crossed the threshold or an inflection point and said, okay, then the community can run it. Yeah, and there are ways to achieve this, right? Like the decentralized governance thing that I mentioned earlier on. That's one good example of it. There are others. For example, if you see how Bitcoin miners have approached it, they're saying, okay, we have this concentration of resources in what you call mining pools, and like if one becomes too big, then it's considered too centralized. So let's break them up. And they don't have to, but in the past they have said, okay, this is better for the community, and it's a risk to not do it, sending the wrong message. So then the big pools split themselves up. So you see it in various forms, and those are the kinds of projects that I would say have the ethos at heart. When you think about it from a point of view of like, how does a traditional company fit into the space?
But even when conceptualizing, let's say, a roadmap and a kind of specialized project that the centralized company is working towards, it is quite perilous to think that the road will always be smooth. And even so, like, the technology will change and you might have competitors in the same space. So it sounds as though that nothing is for certain for sure, because the space is so... It feels very saturated to me. I don't know how you feel about it. Like, there is a lot of, let's say there is one particular sector, but there's like 25 different companies trying to aim for this sector. Maybe only like 2 will succeed. So even though you might have a very legitimate roadmap, you might have a very good vision and team and whatever the case may be, it is still not a guaranteed success. It sounds like that to me.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing for like startups that have nothing to do with blockchain as well, right? So it's like
there's a competition, yeah.
Exactly. They're all competing for a slice of the pie.
Yep.
But what I'd like to point out is like, it depends on what your point of view is as to what the pie is, right? So if you're competing for a slice of the blockchain piece, then you're kind of in this mentality where you have competitors.
Yep.
Right?
Okay.
So, this blockchain X is competing against blockchain Y, competing against blockchain Z, but if you think of it from another point of view where the blockchain space is not the pie, right? And blockchain is just a technology to a different means to an end.
Yep.
Right. So whether that end you're looking for is traditional finance, right? So what slice of the pie of traditional finance is blockchain going to occupy using its decentralized finance or open finance? If the pie that you're eyeing is decentralized applications, so I'm going to take on the client server architecture style web applications or mobile applications.
Yep.
Then what is the slice of the pie that decentralized applications are going to take as part of that? Then when you think about it from that perspective, then it becomes a completely different picture, right? So blockchain X is no longer competing with blockchain Y and blockchain Z. They're all like suddenly friends, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
Right? They're all like trying to find different solutions to similar problems. But, if less than 1% of your competition is another blockchain and 99% plus of your competition is not blockchain,
yep.
right? I mean, you could make the case for competing with another blockchain, but, just probabilistically, your bigger slice of the pie is to be gotten by competing with, the rest
something
of them,
outside of it,
right?
right?
Compete with the 99%, don't compete with the 1%. Yeah.
That is very interesting.
Yeah. So, and to sort of like expand on that point, right? The key challenges to the blockchain space in terms of finance right now is the fact that is just size. How much value is locked in the blockchain space in the entire finance sector? Like, yeah, it's making lots of waves in the news, but it's still tiny. Like it's less than 1%. Right. As big as Bitcoin is, as big as the rest of DeFi is, it's still less than 1%. Right. I'm not too much into that, so maybe my figures are out of date, but it's still tiny, right? The big slice of the pie is competing with cryptocurrencies, decentralized finance. In terms of web applications, it's kind of like a different space. So let's talk about like the different generations of the web, right?
Different generations. You have to explain on that.
Yeah. So web 1, right, is like your first internet experience where maybe you went to, I don't know, GeoCities and created your website. Was that something in your time?
I might have heard of it. I've seen YouTube videos analyzing that, but that's okay. Yeah.
So I was one of those kids who created a GeoCities website. It's like, type some HTML code and I've got a website now, and it's got all these really garish blinking text with marquee scrolling around and stupid GIFs running around the border.
Yep. So that's web 1.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just, for the lulz. But the main thing is that those websites didn't really do much that you couldn't do on printed paper, right? So you can think of it as a substitute for a newspaper or a magazine.
Okay.
Right? Maybe it had some animations and that's about it.
Yep.
Right? So that's something that you wouldn't get in a newspaper.
Yep.
Then you had Web 2, right? This is where you have your username and your password and you could log in and you could do stuff. Stuff started becoming dynamic. And your websites, would be personalized to you, right? And this sort of this aspect of, and that became known as Web 2, right? It was sort of led to this ability of centralization by certain companies, because like if you concentrate your server resources in like Google or Yahoo or whatever it was at the time, like you would just be able to out compete everyone else, right? Like the average user couldn't run their own Google, right? They could run their own GeoCities-like website. That was completely feasible, right? But once you wanted to run your own search engine or your own social media platform or whatever, you would need something as powerful as Facebook or Google was capable of doing.
Is it too taxing, like the computing power or something that's needed?
Like you would need like a lot of computing power, for sure. You would need to have like dedicated software engineering talent. It would exceed the hobbyist tier, right? So like the Web 1 websites, you could do it as a hobbyist, right? A Web 2 thing, like as a hobbyist, you could still participate in it. There are lots of excellent examples of that. Like for example, Blogspot, right? So that was an example of Web 2 where you didn't have to run your own web server or anything, but everyone had a blogger, right? At the time, and you use your username and login to username and password to log in. You would edit your blog post and you'd post it up, and that was like sort of like in between of having your own website that you'd create and run from scratch yourself to to what you have now, where Instagram is probably like the antithesis of that, where you're so siloed in what you can do. Like you can put a picture and you can put a caption, you can hashtag, you can put the @handles
tags and
of,
whatever,
of the other people involved, and that's about it. You can't even put a hyperlink to something else, and that's like is such an abomination to me as a software engineer, right? Like how can you have a website that doesn't allow links? This is insane, right? Like to me, it's revolting, right? And that's like the pinnacle Web 2ization of, and that's all made possible, and people actually want to use it because it's so easy to use, and like it works, it's so snappy, the user experience is great, blah blah blah. But like if you think about it in the bigger scheme, it's like I don't like this. I don't like this direction that the web has gone. Okay, so that's Web 2. Now Web 3, you're saying, okay, let's turn this thing on its head, right? Let's have the backend, right? So the servers that are usually controlled by a single entity now be run in a decentralized way, in a way that is upfront and transparent about what it does. You can't change the rules on you arbitrarily, etc., etc. Things I mentioned before, and like you would go, when you log in to a website, you'd be interacting through it with your crypto wallet, right? And that's like maybe a user experience problem, right? And then your interactions with it would be slow, right? It'd take you 15 seconds to get a response if you're using Ethereum, at least. And you'd also have to pay some money to interact, like what's called a gas fee, each time you interact with it in a way that changes the state on the blockchain. And that's just like fundamental way in how this, this network is designed to be monetized. So, the network doesn't need to be run through advertising revenue or selling your information or whatever, right? The economic incentive is for them to do it in such a way that you can do it in a permissionless way. They don't have to sell you ads to make money. Like, the fees that you're paying them are their income. So you're not the product that's being sold, right? By the operator of the centralized server to another business. You're not the product anymore. You are actually their customer. Yeah. So if you're not paying for something, then someone else is paying for you to use that same utility, right? So then you are no longer the customer, right? So yeah. So there's like there's that benefit of that, you actually being the customer and you getting like sort of like your sovereignty back in how you interact with the web. And something like a website where there's no ability to add links would probably never like exist under that economic circumstance or design. However, right, they still have the slowness to solve the scalability problems of how fast it is to interact with that.
Yep.
And the usability problem, you know, like people are used to usernames and passwords. They're not used to installing a browser wallet, crypto wallet, and understanding what gas is and what your address and public key and private key and all that stuff is. It's
this new terminology that I guess the layman might not necessarily care for, because they're so used to, let's say, using like a Google or using like an Instagram, that if there's a even though that there might be an alternative that is beneficial for them in the long run, it might take a while, or they might not even shift towards it, because I guess with regards to, let's say, talking about Instagram per se, even though I guess from someone in the crypto space point of view, there's a lot of negatives to it. But I guess from a layman's point of view, the most important factor is like the network effect is still there. I mean, your friends are still there. You can still look at people.
The average user loves Facebook, loves Instagram.
Yep.
You know, like to me, from a tech point of view, Facebook is still okay. Like it's still a website. It doesn't, you know, like it has other things about it that maybe one would consider evil, like selling you ads, selling your data, you know, misinformation, all that stuff. That's still bad. But from a technical point of view, it's still a website. Right. And the way it allows you to interact with it, yes, it does give you a lot of restrictions. Right. But you know, it still doesn't violate completely one of the principle or some of the principles of the internet. Whereas Instagram is like, it doesn't care. It's like, I'm just going to give users what they want and, you know, screw the ethos.
Yep. How do you think this space would develop, like Web 3.0? Do you think that there will be more adoption with regards to decentralized web applications and services? Because I think it's very interesting right now. Like if you were to look at how people thought about the internet in the early 2000s or even before that, you get a lot of the same, or already you will get reactions that you wouldn't hear right now. Like it's a new thing. Like why would I go to the web and use email, for example? Right now it's very normal. Do you think it's only a matter of time before something like, let's say, like a web-based wallet and all these like specialized phrases become the norm?
Yeah. So again, you're asking me to have a crystal ball, which I don't. So there, like I said before, there could be a phase of like maybe linear accumulation of users. So you go from 1% to 2%, 3% steadily. And then that might continue forever, or it might plateau. Possible, right? Another possibility is that it might hit some inflection point, and then after which it goes exponential. And then you'll get something like what you get with like switching from snail mail to email, or from, you know, using a landline telephone to a smartphone with apps.
Yep.
You know, like all of these things, they went through like maybe like a period of like
the slow adoption curve. Yeah.
And then inflection point go up.
Yep.
I would like to see that inflection point go up, obviously. Yep. But I can't predict the future, you know. And I would say that these problems that I mentioned do need to be solved. Right.
The scalability of it.
Usability, scalability, right? So, and I do see a lot of promise, right? So, for example, apart from the issue with using wallets that I mentioned earlier on, assuming the user has gotten over that hurdle, or assuming that there is an alternative type of wallet that a user finds comfortable, that abstracts that whole concept of managing your own keys away.
Yep.
I have seen quite a few solutions in that space, but nothing that has sort of taken off quite yet. But let's say they get past that hurdle. Now the next one will be maybe you say you want to interact, but you don't want to have to pay for the transactions, right? Or you want to pay for a lower fee for the transactions because it's getting quite expensive now, right? Because of the scalability problems. So either the scalability problems get solved, or you find some way to sort of find some technical smarts to make it cheaper, right? And I mean, I won't enumerate the different ways that are being tackled, but there are quite a few in the space. For example, you could have a blockchain, and then that blockchain has another blockchain called a layer 2 blockchain.
Oh, like a layer on top. Okay.
Yeah. So, and that one has less of a bottleneck because it's designed to be used in a layer 2 manner. And then so the main blockchain offloads the computational load into the second one, and then it syncs back up every now and then. That is that's for example one solution, right? To this problem, right? And another way to do it is to sort of like say, instead of sending the transaction yourself directly in your wallet, you say, okay, I will sign a permission slip for someone else to sign that transaction, but I do it in such a way that, cryptographically signed, and it says that, yes, okay, so this person can only do this activity on there, and then that other entity sort of aggregates all of these things together and then does it in one transaction. So various ways to like sort of improve usability and sort of solve the scalability problem at the same time. And the more of these that there are, then the more solutions, the more users, I would say, would start to adopt these solutions. Another example or
another example, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, remember how I said in Bitcoin they have to solve this mundane task over and over again to prove that they have done this amount of computational effort. So that's called proof of work, right? The
proof of work. Okay.
Yeah, proof of work. So the work being the computational effort. So then there's a alternative thing called proof of stake, right? Where it works, the term stake kind of is an escrow, right? So instead of saying that I get to say that these sets of transactions are valid and getting added to the block, and for the right to do that, I have to do this proof of work. I do a proof of stake where I essentially put my money into a pot in the table, right? And say, okay, this is my stake, and I will process these transactions. And if they are valid and no one has any complaints about them, then great, I get my money back plus the reward. But if they're not, then I lose it, right? So you're substituting computational effort for monetary, loss/gain, right? And that's the name proof of stake, right? So you change the proof mechanism that is used in the consensus by which all the nodes in the network, the peer-to-peer network, agree upon who gets to decide what the next set of transactions is and whether or not they're valid.
Very interesting.
And the reason why I mentioned that in this context is because when that happens, right, it removes a lot of computational effort, right? Because you don't need to do all these quote unquote mundane computations. Also has a very nice effect that it won't be as polluting from all the energy consumption.
Does it come with its own problems?
Well, it's not battle hardened enough.
Okay.
Yeah. So proof of work, like, it has more than a decade of proof that it is resilient to attacks.
Is a decade very long in the development space?
Yeah. It is. Well, in the development space, I would still say quite long.
Okay.
In the blockchain space, that is the gold standard because that's as long as it's been around. Well, slightly more.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. From your point of view, when you are developing an application, or let's say a decentralized application or service, what do you prioritize? Since there are so many things that might have potential issues, what do you personally prioritize? Or is it specific to the use case?
I mean, yeah, maybe it is specific to the use case, but I would say in general, you have to have a good design from, I guess, two key things. One is assuming present day decentralized application technology. So this may change, right? One thing to be super sure about is that you're using your data storage and your computational effort efficiently, right? Because you can accomplish the same task in several different ways, depending on how you decide to store the data, how you decide to process the data, right? And you can sort of do more computation for less storage, or vice versa, and you have to find the balance.
Yep.
Or you can even like say, I'm going to, for example, do parts of my application on chain, meaning inside the smart contract. And then the rest of it, I ship it off chain, meaning I'm using a centralized application architecture. So I'll keep the critical parts of it that need to be decentralized on chain. And then I'll have the ancillary parts, right? That are less, that require less proof, right? It doesn't need to be on an immutable ledger. And I'll put that off chain using, another technology that isn't a smart contract. And that concept is called a hybrid application. So like efficiency is ultra important because, there are so many constraints in terms of costs.
Yep.
In this space that you wouldn't even blink an eye at in the centralized space because it's, orders of magnitude different. That's one key thing. The other key thing is that the smart contract execution platform is it's immutable, right? And that gives you all these good properties. But one of the bad things is that if you do make a mistake, it's irreversible, right? So whoever did that, right, gets away with it, or gets cheated, or whatever the intent originally was, right? And like if you send money in your DBS account and you get the account number wrong, within a certain reasonable time period, you can ring up the bank and say, please reverse this transaction, and they'll generally do it for you. You can't do that in any blockchain, right, for any transaction. And that applies to a smart contract interaction as well. So in this space, more so than traditional application development, where you can reverse transactions or the equivalent of transactions, you have to have a higher level of like testing of whether the code does what it's actually supposed to do. And a large part of that is a subset, but a significant subset of it is security auditing as well.
Security, okay, what is that?
So software testing is just like regular software testing. You just have to adapt it for this new programming language and this new environment it's being run in. Nothing too much to talk about there if you're, a software engineer who has already done this stuff. But with security audits, maybe it's quite different because they are more prominent in the space. So how are they different, right? So one of the things is you have a higher tendency to need to map out all the possible ways in which this code could execute, right? And sort of define a set of rules or constraints that should not be violated, right? And then you sort of programmatically generate tests. So it's a different kind of testing. And you get that in traditional software development as well. It's just that in this space is more important, right? So you have, and you have things like static analysis. I don't want to define that. You also have things like fuzz testing, so on and so forth. So like you get that category of things, like additional level of testing. Then you also have like some interesting things that are more specific to, I would say, applications that are specific to that are common in the blockchain space. So, for example, you would do a thing. For example, if you have a smart contract and it keeps a tally of the amount of each token that each user has, right? Then one attacker might do something like screw with the code in it by transferring money into the contract that it wasn't expecting and it can't say no to, right? And then suddenly the tally doesn't add up and the contract freezes and everyone loses their funds, right? That's actually, So you get these kinds, like you have like a list of hundreds of these kinds of smart contract specific vulnerabilities, and you have a specific type of company or profession called smart contract auditors who are specifically trained to look at these things and also sort of spot them as they crop up in the wild or preemptively even. So this is like there are some aspects of it that are quite different.
So for yourself, being in this space for a while, what motivates you to continue to create, or what excites you about? Okay, so it's a two-parter. What motivates you to continue to create, and what excites you about the space, like in looking into the future or looking at right now? What excites you?
I think like I perhaps have the same answer to both questions, and something I alluded to earlier on, which was that this space is like a greenfield space, right? There's so many things that are newly possible because of a removal of red tape, newly possible because of the fundamental nature of the technology, it being decentralized. The concept of an immutable ledger opens up all these possibilities, and like just the amount of possible inventiveness that could go on there is attractive, right? And and you can sort of like see the horizon in a lot of like technologies, and like, okay, so you can see this being used to build blah blah blah, and then it'll attain the same level of what you could achieve with the existing technology in 5 years from now or something. You can sort of see the horizon. In this space, I haven't quite seen the horizon yet.
That's interesting.
It's still like too far away.
But would the goal be to try to carve out or try to make this?
Yeah, so that's what I mean, right? Like it's a green field, right? And you can do whatever you want. It's not like other spaces where there's kind of like a well-trodden path and you can maybe deviate a little bit from it.
Ah, interesting.
This is like, okay, there's blank. Go.
Okay. In turning the conversation back to the development club and based in Singapore, you mentioned initially about how before the club you saw that people were more fixated on, I guess, the price of it as opposed to the development.
Yeah, speculative.
The speculative price of
aspects of it.
Has that changed after starting the club, and how has your experience been, I guess, running it initially and meeting new people?
I would like to say that I've made a dent, but to be honest, I don't think so. Like the only practical thing that I've seen come out of it is that a few people, who have attended, they have, become more than acquaintances, friends. I chat with them. That's nice. But a lot of them, they were already like into this angle of it. It's just that they kind of got together and got to know me, perhaps.
Yeah.
So that was nice. But I would say in terms of absolute numbers of people that would have impacted, it would be on the scale of 20.
Okay.
It's not big. I am being brutally honest. Yeah. I'm not making any grand claims here.
Yeah. But were these, let's say for these 20, were they like beginners or were they?
Well, there were some beginners, but they were already on that path. So it's not like I converted their thinking or anything, right? Maybe I would have contributed to their journey.
Yep.
In getting to where they wanted to, and that's great, But I wouldn't like to answer your question, like, did I impact the space? I would say in Singapore, no, not really. The bigger impact on the space is coming from, whoever is doing this outside of Singapore, because everything's on the internet and, you learn, and this space. I also discovered that there were other groups who are doing something similar to me as part of this, and that was great as well. I even had one group that was started by someone who attended one of my sessions.
That's cool.
Which is great.
Yeah.
I have to check in on that. I haven't. Like I said, I haven't been keeping up with it properly for the past 1.5 years.
Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of like you lose that thing face to face because there's a lot of effort organizing events.
A lot,
right? Enormous amount of effort, like logistically, and that's discounting the prep of the actual content itself, which is what I was thinking would be going into it naively. 90% of the effort, right? But actually that was probably 10-20% of the effort, right? 80% of it was the logistics, all the ancillary stuff that surrounded organizing an event. And I've learned my lesson, and so I would like continuing creating the content, the educational material, right? But in order to go through with the effort of all the ancillary stuff, the logistical stuff, to me, like for selfish reasons, right, I need that in-person thing. And this current lockdown is just not allowing for that.
From your perspective, is Singapore a good place to work on these technologies? Because I think I've read some articles of how, I guess the word is open and inviting, Singapore is with regards to blockchain technology and I guess the infrastructure it is. What are your thoughts on it?
I would say Singapore is not a bad place, but it's not the best either.
What are the pros and cons of it?
Okay, so like Ethereum Foundation is based in Zug, which is a part in ZUG, part of Switzerland.
Okay.
And they have like a, I would say, decentralized form of government in the sense that each geographical area, like think of it as a town, I guess, with the surrounding areas, like the mayor of that town has much more autonomy than, let's say, Ang Mo Kio versus Yio Chu Kang has, right?
Okay. Yeah,
right.
Fair enough.
So they basically said, okay, this town says, I want to be the crypto valley, right, as opposed to Silicon Valley, right? I want to be the crypto valley of Switzerland, and suddenly I've got all the regulations in place that allow that to happen, and to this day, they haven't had any trouble, right? When you think of it at a bigger level, like at a full government level, you have other countries like Gibraltar, which is a part of, like, geographically it's in Spain, right at the bottom at the Mediterranean, and it's, I think, I don't know exactly, but it's an autonomous territory that is linked in some way to the UK.
Okay.
Right, but it, for most intents and purposes, it is its own country.
Okay,
right?
Interesting.
And it has its own laws, and it has a specific license for cryptocurrencies, and it's very, I would say, friendly, right?
Would friendly in this case mean that there is less regulation?
The regulation is drafted in such a way that it is actually drafted for cryptocurrency companies to operate. And also it allows for the level of flexibility for the level of maturity of the technology.
Okay.
Right. So when something is this new, the knee-jerk reaction of most governments, including the Singapore government, is to regulate it as if it were part of the existing economy, a part of the existing rules, right? Because that's how the legal and regulatory space operates in general, right? They're like, what do we already know that is a part of that is similar to this.
Yep.
Okay, let's regulate it according to that rules. And then they would have some iterative improvements upon that. Right. But they don't go for a clean slate and like say, okay, this is completely new. What do I do about this? And then
you change it along the way.
Think from first principles all the way up. And I think like some jurisdictions, the two that I mentioned, have made some extent to do that. To a large extent, they have, done that, thinking from first principles, what would be a crypto regulation. Whereas like in Singapore, you still see it's friendlier. I would say, like, some other countries, they just outright ban, right? So that hasn't happened here. But you also get these, you also see, like, basically it being shoehorned into existing, compliance and laws and etc. And I mean, like if you try to use crypto exchanges, right, and you try to deposit your SGD in it, there'll be a bunch of rules. Do not mention the word crypto. Do not mention the name of the exchange. Do not use the same amount that you're transferring more than once. And you're like, this company is legal. Why do they have to operate under this veil?
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because the laws are drafted in such a way that, it gives enough leeway for those who do not believe in it to cast it aside. Right. And when something is so novel, right, that's enough, right? That's like sort of like you're not illegal, but you're not legal either. And you're sitting in that in-between space and you don't have any like certainty to operate. Yep. And I would classify, the current state as being that. So it's good enough. You can operate here without, the threat of suddenly being, saying, okay, you're illegal, get out of, cease operations. Yep. That's not going to happen in Singapore, I believe. Well, I hope so. But at the same time, it's not the best either. I've seen other jurisdictions do it better.
Interesting. In closing out this conversation, I'm curious to know your thoughts about data and privacy, especially moving forward into the future. Like, what are your current thoughts on how? Because with regards when people talk about, I guess, centralized exchanges and I guess the quote unquote amount of like power and control they have, they talk about the amount of data they collect as well. And we alluded to the fact that these companies, yes, the product is free, quote unquote, but you essentially become the product. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the ethos with regards to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and things of the nature in the space, it seems as though that it is sort of empowering in a sense. Like it gives you this sense of personal agency that it is your responsibility. You take care of it. If you fuck up, you fuck up. But that's not the case with regards to, let's say, like a traditional bank, because you can undo it, or you're just handing, in a sense, you're just putting your money with the bank and the bank is quote unquote handling it for you. Reflecting back onto data, what are your thoughts on it now and moving forward? Do you think that people will be more cognizant of the amount of data that they are giving out? Do you think they'll be more private? Yeah.
I would say that adoption is not widespread enough for people to have that level of awareness.
Okay.
Right, yet. It may come with time. So the average user who uses Facebook, right, probably puts their real location inside the platform unwittingly all the time. So when you take a photograph with your phone, there's some metadata in it that basically contains your GPS coordinates. If you have GPS on, super highly accurate.
Yep.
And if you don't have GPS on, is the location of your nearest cell phone tower, which is still pretty accurate.
Pretty accurate, yeah.
They know which street you're on at least.
Yep.
Right. And every time you upload a photo to Facebook knows where you are, even though you never actually gave Facebook your geolocation permission. And the average user isn't aware of that, right? And this is like a technology that's been around for so long. Facebook's been around for more than 10 years, and the average user still doesn't know these things, right? Maybe a larger percentage of people are becoming aware of this, but I would still say that even if they do know, they kind of don't care as well. So there's like there's like both ignorance and apathy going on here. It's like, why do I care what Facebook knows where my location is?
Yep.
So yeah. But then if you come back more specifically to your question, I think centralized exchanges, and I emphasize the word centralized because there are also decentralized exchanges, for which what I'm about to say doesn't apply. Whenever you buy, say, Bitcoin on a centralized exchange, right?
Yep.
You are not actually buying Bitcoin, right? They're just maintaining their own database, not a blockchain database like just Postgres or MySQL or whatever, right? Their own database, and says, okay, this user, right, has this much Bitcoin. They just paid me this many SGD, so now they have this much Bitcoin.
It's a ledger, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a centralized mutable ledger, the opposite of
mutable
Bitcoin.
Ledger. Okay.
Yeah, immutable, not changeable, mutable, changeable. Yeah. So that's what's happening, right? And only at the point of time when you're doing a withdrawal in cryptocurrency, that point of time you're actually interacting with the blockchain, right? And that point of time, then you're actually trading Bitcoin, right? But the average user doesn't really know this, right?
Yep.
Or care about this. So we're coming back to the same combo, right? Like
apathy and ignorance.
Yeah, exactly. So they either don't care about it or they don't know about it. And when you have that, right, then you're basically, that user is primarily interacting with a centralized application.
Yep.
So they don't have any of these like decentralization aspects to it. They don't even have the pseudonymity.
Yep.
And I should sort of like have a sidebar here. Even if you're on a blockchain, remember that it's not private.
Yep.
By definition, every single transaction on the blockchain is on a public ledger, right? Assuming that you're interacting with a public permissionless blockchain such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, etc. There are other types of blockchains. Let's not go into that. But the default type of blockchain, the main type of blockchain, anyone can see who has transacted with anyone else.
Yep.
Right? So you have pseudonymity, right? Not anonymity. And as soon as someone connects an address, a cryptocurrency address with a real world identity, right? So say, okay, this address is 0x blah, 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 belongs to Kevin.
Yep.
Then from then on, they know not only who you are and whenever you transact, how much they've transacted, how much you've transacted, but also who all your friends are. And then there are forensics analysis companies that actually just go through its whole trove of data and do something that's not too different from what, probably people who scrape Facebook data do, right? And then they can just build up this wealth of information about your transactional network as opposed to your social network.
Yep.
And there you go. You've recreated the same privacy nightmare scenario. Yeah. So you kind of like can't. I don't think that this technology enhances privacy in any way. If in some aspects,
opposite direction,
yeah, it actually makes it easier for these analysis to happen because it's all out in the open.
Yeah.
But then to some extent that doesn't matter anyway, because most of these companies will just sell your data, right? And they don't even have to go through this process of de-pseudonymizing or de-anonymizing your data, right? They just literally have the data like in raw form, right? They don't have any probabilistic guessing to go on and so forth. There is one technology that is becoming popular in the blockchain space, although it exists outside of the blockchain space, to protect your privacy. So Bitcoin was the first blockchain and one of the earliest blockchains that sort of copy pasted Bitcoin to add its own features. This is not like a token, right? They didn't create a token on top of Bitcoin. It's like a new blockchain itself. Was Zcash, right?
Zcash, okay.
Yeah, like the letter Z cash. That's their original name. I think they may have renamed. Yeah, they have renamed, but I don't know. I can't recall the name.
Sure.
Anyway, they use something called zero knowledge proofs, which is some super complicated cryptographic technology, which I don't fully understand myself. To say that when you transact on a blockchain, you have two categories of transaction, right? One is you can have your in the clear transaction. Another one, you can have a transaction that is encrypted using zero knowledge proofs. So the transaction is still in public, on the ledger, right? And it's still visible to anyone. It's just that it's garbled. And so long as you're not party to that transaction, you can't actually read that. But they've done it in such the zero knowledge proofs things. They're done in a smart way, such that even though the ledger as a whole, parts of it are sort of invisible, they can still prove when you try to spend that money that you do actually own it.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's mind-boggling, right? Yeah. So that has existed for a long time, right? And a few different people have sort of ported that the logic that does zero knowledge proofs into smart contracts. And then you suddenly got this new crazy thing going on. So for example, if you wanted to have voting happen on a blockchain using decentralized governance, and let's say it was a shareholder meeting, in most cases, you don't need privacy for that. So anyone can see who has voted for what,
Yep.
right? Then fine,
Yep.
just use a regular transaction, right? But then let's say you have like an election for, a politician,
Yep.
right? You want to keep your vote private.
Yep.
And that's because that's how the thing that you're currently modeling, your vote has to be private and you don't want people to know who you voted for, etc. Right? So that expectation of complete privacy is there. So then you say, okay, so then in that case, I need to use this technology and add that to my smart contract such that I can have just expose the total number of people who voted for, say, each candidate or
Yep.
each option in the ballot sheet, right? Without actually revealing who has
Yep.
voted for each one, which would be the default.
Yep.
Right. And that's an interesting application.
That's a
right?
use case of it.
Yeah. So that technology has to become or a technology that accomplishes something similar, right? Would have to become more widespread and commonplace in order for that to flourish, right? And in order for to have a public blockchain with actual privacy.
Yep.
I don't know how far away that is, but one of the limiting factors is that means that smart contract becomes very heavy to compute, so it's expensive to interact with, and then you have all these scalability problems
Yep.
that already were there compounded.
Yeah. Yep.
So this conversation has been highly self-referential, so you've guided it quite well.
But sounds as though because you talked about the security aspect, and let's say if the mission of someone is to create something that's public facing and interacting, let's say for governance or elections, for example, it really has to be battle tested, because you wouldn't want something like this to be rolled out and to be the victim of certain vulnerabilities that you might not have anticipated, because that would affect the course of a country or something like that.
Yeah. So there's like two levels for this, right? One is the underlying cryptography, like what algorithms you use for your encryption, etc. And then there's another level where your smart contracts themselves need to be audited for various vulnerabilities. But both apply. Yeah.
It's just been a mind-boggling conversation.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about non-blockchain stuff in the end.
One last point.
Yeah.
I saw on a blog post of yours that you were planting trees.
Okay. So we will talk about a non-blockchain thing. Yeah.
That is...
Which tree? Which one?
I know there was a blog post and there were 3 specific trees.
Oh, yeah, okay. So
it could be a while back.
That was a NParks thing.
Yeah,
National
so
parks.
Could you speak to that, and is it something of interest to you? Why or what led to you making that decision to want to take part in it?
Well, okay, so yeah, this is completely different.
Yeah.
So there's a, I mean, if you look at the current statistics and numbers, the trends that we're headed towards, basically, if you look at Singapore, about, I would say most of the CBD and most of East Coast will be underwater by 2050, right?
2050.
Yeah, that's the science.
So soon.
that's where the numbers are leading us.
Okay.
Right. And think about what would happen to Singapore if that didn't happen. If okay, so right now, and this, by the way, if you watch the National Day rally in, I can't remember what year. I think it may have been 2019. I can't remember.
Okay.
There's literally Lee Hsien Loong. He's standing there in his rally, pointing to a map of Singapore, showing these are the parts of Singapore that be underwater, and that's where I got this information. Right? I'm like, this is crazy. And he said, okay, but we've got it under control. We're gonna build like all of these barriers and all of that to keep the stuff out of it. All the train stations and anything with an underground tunnel will be raised from 2 meters above sea level to 4 or whatever it is, because that's how much we predict the rise will be. And so Singapore's land that was so preciously reclaimed will remain above water. So that's great, but only Singapore and maybe a handful of other really rich city-states can afford to do that for its entire country. You're going to see large swathes of the world like going completely underwater, and large swathes of the world, unfortunately, for historical and practical reasons, live along the coast. Right? The majority of the human population lives in coastal areas, right? If I'm not mistaken, it's like 2/3 of the population at least. So 2/3 of the population is going to become, flooded out of their homes.
Submerged,
So, I mean, I've known about climate change for a while, but the severity of it has hit home recently. So, I do a bunch of things to sort of mitigate that. So, like every month, so first it started off with slacktivism. Right, so activism was slack, so a portmanteau of the two. So I started off with slacktivism, where I would just, I think, there's this, I should know the name of the things I donate to. So there's Project Vesta or Vespa, I can't remember. There's this new technology where they found a particular type of rock where they grind it up and it can absorb huge amounts of carbon from the ocean. And so I give them $100 a month. There's another one, I think it started out of Iceland, where they use geothermal power to pump carbon dioxide back underground. And they have a particular rock called basalt. So it literally becomes carbon crystals stuck within this very porous rock. And it's supposed to last there for like hundreds or thousands of years. I can't remember. But basically long enough for it to be considered permanent to resolve this crisis. Or outlive this crisis if it does happen. So I give them $100 a month. Then there's also Project WREN, WREN. So that's tree planting and monitoring of deforestation. So I also give them, I think, also $100 a month. So a bunch of things like that. So that's my selectivism, right? So it was just like, okay, I opened up my wallet, I did my thing. Then I decided to, take things a bit more like personally, right? So like actually walk the talk. So first thing I did was,
take your water bottles out. Don't use plastic.
No more plastic.
Gotcha.
Whenever possible. So, I don't tapao anything from anywhere. If I do, I bring my own container. So like when I go to Mr. Bean, I'm literally the only guy who'll come up there with a bowl, like a glass container saying, hey, fill this up. I do that at the hawker center as well. And they usually just stare at me for enough for me to feel awkward, but not long enough for me to like prompt them to like, come on. So they do that. So
so one thing led to another.
One thing. And what else do I do? Yes. So I also do composting. It's quite hard to do in an apartment. So I bought a couple of bins designed purposely for that. Because if you live, in a like a house with a garden outside, you can just sort of just do what is called aerobic decomposition, or so that's where you just put it in a pile and it decomposes. But that requires soil. Firstly, for the stuff to drain into, and secondly, it also requires lots of ventilation, which you can't achieve in an apartment. It needs to be outdoors. Otherwise, basically, your house is going to stink. Right. So I got these bins. I got a special type of I think it's like when you brew beer, you have the leftover husks and like the cereal grains and whatever's left over. So it has like some microbes in it, and also like a spray. So you combine the two. It's called bokashi. Some nice Japanese word. So it's like a special blend of microbes that allow anaerobic decomposition. So you basically put it in a bin, a special bin which has a tap at the bottom to allow you to drain the garbage juice out.
Interesting.
Technical term for it being leachate, like leach, ATE. So long as you regularly drain that and you keep putting in the microbes, the right type of microbes, it doesn't smell. It has a manageable smell. I'll put it that way.
You don't sound too convincing.
I won't lie. There is a smell, but it's not pungent, right? It's there if you like sort of put it under your sink and keep the door shut. As long as the door doesn't open, you can't, you won't notice it. And then you bring it out and drain it, and then you bring it back in, or you drain it straight into the plumbing or whatever. And what else? There are a few more things. I saw this article about solar farms. So like in Singapore. So there's I think I signed up quite a while ago, but apparently Singapore is home to the, if I'm not mistaken, third largest floating solar farm.
I think I read that article somewhere.
It just came out like 2-3 days ago, right?
And you switched to the supplier or something?
So I switched to the supplier because I heard that they won a tender for the biggest contract to date to install a rooftop solar on HDBs.
That's wow.
So I was like, Santiap, right? That's the name of it. So I was like, okay, I'm giving them their money instead of, by default, your power in Singapore is from burning natural gas, right? So I picked the 100% solar power option, which was surprisingly not that much more expensive. It was like 1% extra or something.
That's negligible.
What it worked out for. I was like, I'm happy to pay a few cents extra, basically. So I did that. And then the tree planting. So that was one thing where I found this program organized by NParks. They doing this 1 million tree planting thing. They basically organized this thing where I mean, did you read the full article?
I skimmed.
Okay. So there's like a part of it that makes me feel like I did something good, but then there's a part of me that feels that it's like a PR stunt as well.
Oh no.
So like basically when you dig soil in Singapore that's in urban areas is typically clay soil, really difficult to dig, right?
Okay.
It's like this, orange stuff that's halfway to brick. Right. If you go out to the forest or whatever, it's normal soil, which is a mix of clay and sand and starts with an H. There's 3 types of soil. Basically the decomposing matter, and you mix them all together and you get different grades of brown soil essentially. But the cheapest type of soil, at least in Singapore, seems to be clay. Right. And when you are in like an estate, an urban estate, they have these strips of land that's punctuating the concrete and the tarmac, right? And then they have like a grass strip, maybe some trees if you're lucky. So that soil is predominantly clay, and it's really hard to dig, right? I've tried it before. And so what they do is they get these construction workers, right, to pre-dig the soil. right?
Okay.
And then they refill it again with the same soil. And then the volunteers, the Singaporeans like myself, who come to that, they dig the soil that's already been pre-dug.
There's something wrong with the sentence you just said.
Yeah, so I was like, it's a bit of like a Sisyphean task, right? So they dig the soil, and then instead of just doing the thing, they put it back.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to some extent, like I feel like I did something good, because without my support, like this program wouldn't get as much prominence or awareness. But then to some extent, I feel like it's a charade.
Yeah.
They could have easily done it much faster without, me.
Yep.
Right. And then the thing that sort of like hammered the point back home was halfway, I wouldn't say halfway through, like 90% of the way through, it started to drizzle.
Fair
Right.
enough.
And then so
Okay.
the NParks volunteer following the rules list, like basically sent us home.
Yep.
And then, these construction workers, these foreign laborers, they would have to fill in the soil, like continue working, because they had operated under a different set of rules, right?
Yeah.
Safety regulation, like, I was like,
that's depressing.
yeah, it's kind of like two tiers of, yeah, it's, but I mean, it is what it is, right? Like we've known in Singapore for a long time, there's this sort of like, if you're a citizen, you're here. And if you're not,
Yep.
you're here.
Yep.
And if you're different levels of here, depending on which nationality you come from, like Malaysians are right at the top. And then like maybe if you're from Bangladesh is right at the bottom, it's like, you know that it's like almost like an open secret. No one really talks about it, but yeah, you like, if I was like, if I ever do that again, I'm going to sort of, cause I only did it once, unfortunately,
Yeah.
But if I ever did it again, I would, bring them some like food or something,
Yeah.
like give away, show them my gratitude. Yeah.
But it does sound like a charade, like what you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with the end goal. Like, okay, so the end goal is that they're going to plant 1 million trees, and they're going to do it with foreign laborers, right? But what they're using Singaporeans for, right, is the awareness, right? Because these programs won't get funded, and people are probably going to be caught up in a cycle of misinformation or whatever,
Yep.
right? If they don't themselves like sort of have boots on the ground doing these things and knowing what they're doing it for. So the more people that are exposed to this, right, that they actually are people that are your neighbors or your friends or your family, right, that would happen, right? But if, let's say, this group of people, foreigners who are largely siloed away from the local population, if you want to put it that way, right? That's not gonna bridge the gap in terms of awareness, right? Then they're not gonna, we're not gonna hear about like, national parks tree planting exercise or the 1 million trees initiative, right? Because I did it, maybe, well, with this podcast, certainly, hopefully a few people, what's the listenership of this podcast?
I'll tell you after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's secured by zero knowledge proof.
But it feels indicative of perhaps a larger, more macro problem as to how we would tackle such issues, because I'm sure there are better ways of running something like this.
Yeah. But the flip side of it is if you didn't have this stratification of society, then things wouldn't be as cheap in Singapore, right? The cost of living in Singapore is tremendous, like contrary to popular belief, is actually quite cheap, right? Relative to your income level.
Yep.
And one of the key reasons for that is because we have extremely cheap labor from overseas that are willing to work for a wage that is significantly higher than what they would earn at home, but still significantly lower than what you would have to pay a Singaporean to do the same work, right? And so kind of like, it's like labor arbitrage and geographical arbitrage all rolled into one. It's a very smart system from an economic point of view, but then it also leaves you with a bit of philosophical,
backlash.
like you wonder, like what is the right balance, and it's hard to. I'm not an economist and I'm not a sociologist, so like I'm unqualified to speak about these things, but I guess I can say how I feel when I encounter or experience these things firsthand.
And I think because of the recent crisis, I think a larger spotlight has been placed upon conversations such as these that traditionally would be swept, I guess, under the rug, or people would just turn a blind eye towards. And I guess more emphasis has been placed on, I guess, the plight, really, because how sustainable is it really to just rely on cheaper and cheaper labor? Like, yes, there is an arbitrage to it, but as the world progresses, I think there will come a certain point where if we don't tackle the issue right now, I think it's gonna come as a shock in the future.
I actually think the trend that the world is on is actually exacerbating inequality. So the trend isn't towards equalization at the moment.
Not at all.
The trend is in fact in the opposite direction. Like while the lockdown and the closure of the borders, or I should say near closure of the borders, has sort of like brought home the point. Like for example, the average renovation, how long has it been delayed? I see outside my house, the bus stop. Usually I will see 10 cigarette butts. Now I see more than 100. It's because there's less foreign laborers, right? And Singaporeans clearly aren't cleaning up after themselves. They're doing business as usual.
On it,
Exactly. It's like somebody else's problem, and like to some extent, the problem has persisted the problem, and this window of the lockdown has sort of given us the opportunity to see it more clearly if we're not blinkered, right? So the person who I assume is, doesn't care or think about these things, which maybe is the majority of the population, is going to continue to litter despite the fact that there is less, that the litter is being picked up less often. Right. It's a sad fact to see it, like, it's like an experiment that you're observing and, not just observing, but also being affected by in real time. So as we're experiencing this, we're seeing, sort of our true nature being less and less hidden. And then you wanna kind of see, like, what if the tap got completely turned off? Would we then like literally swim in our own waste? That could happen. But the tap hasn't been completely turned off, and so therefore society is still functional. But it's sort of has a 10% dysfunctionality almost, enough for you to see the threat of
it's an interesting thought experiment.
But that's the point, right? It's not just a thought experiment, it's happening right in front of you, right? So lots to think about.
I wanted to end with this question. So are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Ooh. I don't know. I would say pessimistic.
Pessimistic, okay.
Yeah, because I would say ceteris paribus. So like all else being equal, human nature is selfish, right? And all the examples I've spoken about, from game theory to like this stratification of society and not my problem attitudes. Like they're all examples of how everyone acts for their own self-interest. And right now, if everyone does act in their own self-interest, it's almost like mutually assured destruction. The thing is that we have all these laws and norms in place in society that ensure that it is invisible or only slightly visible, right? And B, the degradation happens slowly, right? So it's almost like you're the frog who's being boiled alive in water, doesn't realize it until it's too hot, right? That's a very sick analogy. I don't know who was the first one to think about it, but you know, like I feel that, you know, like let's just take the example of climate change, right? So every day we do these things that are negative externalities, right? So if you drive a car or you take a taxi instead of taking public transport, you know, by and large, you're driving, you're
contributing
fuel,
to it,
right? If you have a plastic cup from a takeaway, or you know, you get your food delivered to your house and you have a stack of boxes, you know, all of that, right, is contributing. Let's say each thing is contributing like a hundredth of a millimeter of Singapore submerging, right? But you know, you can get away with it. So people just continue doing it, right? So, you know, and then some people, like, even if confronted with the facts, it's not just ignorance, they're just, you know, that's apathy, right? But some people don't even want to know, right? You know, it's like they'll just brush it off as, you know, fake news or whatever, you know, and then there's also at a bigger scale, there's also like a lot of corporate interests from, I guess, people with a lot of money, enough money to buy opinions, and they will sell people on the idea that, hey, this is actually not real, you know, and you see that in the news all the time. People are getting, like, all these corporations are getting exposed, but they somehow still continue doing it. They just find another way because, and like this comes back to the sort of like the concept of where the incentives are aligned, right? So the incentives are currently aligned to whoever has the most capital. And whoever has the most capital at the moment has their own self-interest in heart to continue the current system for their own profit. And they clearly have enough money to migrate to somewhere that's more than 10 meters above sea level and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. And that's what they care about, right? You know, and you know, so what if all the coastal cities are submerged? You know, like, it's kind of like sick to think about, but that is, that's what makes me feel pessimistic. I hope I'm wrong. I sincerely hope I'm wrong. Day to day, I'm much more optimistic than this. I have to say,
I have led you down a pessimistic path.
But if you ask me to think long term, and I think that kind of does sum it up, right? Like, people are optimistic in the short term, but then, you know, they don't think about the long term, and so, you know, they just continue business as usual. And so that's like another reason which I myself am susceptible to as well, right?
But I guess it's also part of human nature to
It's like the blinkers you put on yourself.
That as well, and to be pessimistic, because I believe asking people from, I guess, 60s, 70s about how they feel about the turn of the century, they will be pessimistic as well. But I guess we are still alive. But I guess it really depends on how far into the future we're talking about. What is your bar of
success? We are still alive.
You know, how far into the future we're talking about. Really. Next year, probably, but 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, it's anyone's guess, really. I mean, I have mentioned the phrase inflection point quite a few times before. So maybe there is an inflection point in corporate interests, you know. Maybe there is. I can't predict the future. Maybe there is an inflection point in human nature, you know. And so we decide to align ourselves for mutually assured non-destruction. Mutually assured non-destruction.
Like maybe that happens, right? And then there's only a few bad actors, you know, who are still in. That could happen, right? But that's not the trend that I'm seeing right now.
Fair enough. Before we close, is there anything else you would like to talk about?
This is something maybe for another conversation. We don't have to do a podcast. I could just talk to you after this. In fact, we could talk about NFTs. But that's a whole nother
rabbit hole.
Okay. Let's not dive in that one now.
We'll dive into that later. Where can people find your work, or where can people reach out to you? Do you do are you open or willing for people to reach out to you to talk about such things? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the easiest way to find me online is if you go to my website, bguiz.com.
bguiz.com. Okay.
Bravo, Golf, Uniform, India, Zulu.
Oh, you have that remembered. Okay.
We all did NS, right?
Yes.
Anyway, and so it's my personal blog, and you'll find a link to all my social media at the top. If you want to learn more specifically about blockchain, I would say there are a few avenues because I wear several hats. The dApps Dev Club, which we talked about before, that's dappsdev.org. It's material mostly designed for software engineers or you want to learn coding for decentralized applications. There's also developers.rsk.co. That's one of the things that I do at my job. So the information site about RSK, more technically oriented, as the name implies. And if you're not, if you're, let's say, like don't want to code or you just want to learn about blockchain in general, there's a lot of I have some guest lectures at SMU. I just ran one last week. So go sign up. Just look for the name of the course. The name of the course changed. It's blockchain for business, I believe. And there's a series of 6 modules. So I teach in 2 of them.
Yep. Is it like an open class that anyone can just sign up, or is it specifically for people in SMU?
Oh, it's not. It's an adult learning program. It's not an SMU student thing.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, anyone can sign up. It's under the Skills Future program.
Yep.
Yeah. And then stay tuned for next year. There will be a diploma in blockchain, yet to be announced.
Yep.
So you'll hear from me when that happens.
Is it like a tertiary level or?
That will be tertiary level, yes. As the name implies, diploma. And I think that will probably start, and if not end of this year, early next year.
Fantastic.
And that will be coding focused as well. Yeah.
All right. This has been a mind-boggling yet very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time, Brandon. No, not at all. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode and feel inspired. If you enjoyed what you heard thus far, do give us a follow on Instagram. And don't forget to share and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.